Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, I make PC tech and hardware related content. So if you're into that, consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell because I've been starting to live stream every other day, if not every day. And we end up having some pretty good conversations. So if you're into this and you're new to PC building and tech like that, make sure to hit that subscribe button. So in this video, I want to talk a lot about how specific components affect the performance of a computer overall. Some viewers can not even be aware of how specifically certain things can be tailored so that you can get the best value or best performance for your money in most situations. So what I'll do is give a rundown about the 7 main parts that you almost 100% of the time need in order for a computer to be up and running, like a full working desktop system. And then what I'll do is elaborate, if I can, on a certain part and how that'll benefit certain uses like gaming or video editing and such. So arguably one of the most important parts of your computer is the CPU. Now you hear this term tossed out a lot everywhere. It stands for the central processing unit, and what it does is basically handles all of the logic, all of the math that has to be done in any task in your computer. So if you're playing video games, especially online video games, everything has to be processed logically on where specific players are in a certain part of the map or what you're specifically doing so that it translates. So depending on what you're going to use your computer for, you're going to look at 2 different things. One of those is the core count. Every processor has a certain amount of cores, whether that's 2 all the way to like 32. And you're also going to want to take a look at the clock speed. That's how fast those cores can run and the processor overall. Nowadays, when we're talking about gaming, we tend to look at a lot of Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 processors and like super expensive systems. But the truth is that when we're talking about value and bang for buck, you don't need all that much. For example, when we're talking about video games, a processor is going to benefit more from a higher clock speed, say in the speeds, than the amount of cores that you have. If we're going into technical terms and we talk about some games that actually use like 6 cores instead of 4 cores in a processor, well, that's an exception. For the majority, like 80-70% of your games will totally benefit more from higher clock speeds than more cores. This is specifically why you'll see the Ryzen 3300X, for example, a 4-core processor and a pretty high clock speed. I think it's like 4.3 gigahertz. This is why you'll see it listed as the best gaming budget CPU out there, as opposed to something like the Ryzen 5 3600, who on paper is technically better because it has 6 cores and a similar clock speed. If you're wondering at this point, more cores does mean that you'll probably have better processing results, say video editing or more hefty tasks besides gaming. Next up is the memory, and we're talking about memory. When we're talking about memory, it's actually a pretty easy section to cover because, well, the more the better, right? But how much do I really need? Obviously, you shouldn't be spending like $200 when your budget is like a $500 computer. So what you're probably going to want to get is something around 8 gigs or higher. Literally 8 gigs is the borderline, the lowest that you'll want to go. And I can't really recommend, no matter what you're doing, anything lower than 8 gigs. Now, when we're talking about the sweet spot, however, it's around 16 gigs. And for the most part, you won't see a huge difference in what clock speeds your RAM is at unless you are on a Ryzen build. So if your processor is a Ryzen CPU, it is proven to benefit from higher clock speeds, say anything above 3000 megahertz. But if you are an Intel or really don't care about how fast you can multitask and things like that, or your raw gaming speed, then I guess 2666 megahertz is okay. Next up I want to talk about is the motherboard. The motherboard, I want to get this out of the way, is something that will not affect your performance whatsoever. Like if you have a video editing or a gaming or a streaming or a gaming and streaming computer, it won't affect like how good anything looks or how fast it runs. What it will do, however, is give you more features, more capabilities to, say, overclock in your gaming. Say you have a Ryzen overclocked CPU and you just want to overclock that. Well, a premium, a more higher end motherboard will definitely help with that. But if we're talking about basic, simple use, something like a $70 motherboard actually wouldn't be a terrible option because you don't need the most premium VRMs to overclock. The next thing I want to talk about is your storage. And this is probably based on personal preference. A lot of the parts on a computer are based on personal preference, but I think this is the most vulnerable to be argued by many people. So when we're talking about storage, you could go several different routes. You could go an M.2 SSD, which is something that you install into your motherboard. You could go a pretty quick SSD by SATA, or you could go with a simple classical mechanical hard drive. We all love mechanical hard drives, but the truth is that they're very slow. So if you really care about your loading time, like turning on your PC and booting up Windows, or if you care about loading into a game quicker, it won't necessarily help your game run faster. It'll just help with read and write speeds. So if you really care about that, I'd say look into a M.2 SSD or a SATA SSD, depending on your budget. But if you really just want a lot of space and you don't care about speed, I'd probably point you towards a hard drive. And it's not a terrible option whatsoever. Many people see a lot of people recommending SSDs just because it's overall better, but there is a trade-off at the end of the day. The next thing I want to talk about is the GPU. Now, for graphics cards, it's pretty straightforward as well. If we're talking about a lot of video editing, your GPU might be the one that's being used the most, since you're probably rendering a lot of effects, a lot of visuals. When we're talking about true editing, we're not talking about just chopping clips. That uses a lot of CPU power and a lot of power of your computer in general. But when I say editing, I mean a lot of visuals and effects. That's like a proper project. Then that's going to require a lot of GPU power, a lot of visuals. And that's where your graphics card comes into place. Depending on how good that is, it'll make this process either a nightmare or just super satisfying and like buttery smooth. Now, most of you, I'm assuming, might use this for gaming. So let's talk about that. Now, for the most part, if we're talking about literally like any game, a better graphics card will output better results. But then again, please take into consideration what games you'll be playing and at what resolution and what settings. Because if I were you, I personally wouldn't want to spend a $500 GPU on a simple title like Fortnite when your monitor is 60 hertz. You're just throwing money away into your computer that you're just never going to see again. So please be considerate on how you're spending your GPU. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll always do you good to get a super high-end GPU. This is one of those that doesn't really play a whole lot. Just like a motherboard, it doesn't affect the performance of your computer, but the motherboard at least does give you features. When we're talking about power supply in a case, the case is actually overlooked because you definitely want to make sure you're getting a lot of good airflow now. You don't want to spend like something way over your budget, but you need to make sure that you're getting good airflow. It's not something that will collect a lot of dust. And at the end of the day, you want it to look pretty good. So make sure it covers the necessities and then your want. And as for the power supply, you'll be fine with something that isn't dirt cheap. So make sure it's pretty name brand and it supports the power for all your components. You can do that by checking on PC Part Picker. Anyways, guys, thank you all so much for watching. I went through a brief general description of every part. I didn't go too in depth into like every single scenario that you're gonna use because at the end of the day, everybody's situation is different. So if you have any further questions or comments, you know where to leave those in the comment section down below. Or if you have any suggestions for the next video, definitely leave those there. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'll leave that in the description below. Appreciate your support. And as always, peace.